Hey there, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I wanted to talk to you today about something that is, I think, really practical for when you're trying to speed up a piece at the piano. There's two strategies that I mainly recommend to my students, and two strategies that are different but work in different scenarios and are both really effective. And I want to talk about what those two strategies for speeding up a piece are today. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Let's get started. All right, so method number one for speeding up a piece is these are going to be sort of poorly named, but I'm just going with it, walking. And method number two is flying. And I'm going to break them down and talk about each of them, how they work. And then I'm going to demo them at the piano so you can see what they're going to look like in action when you're actually trying to learn a piece. So the first method, the walking method of speeding up a piano piece, is one that a lot of you are probably already familiar with because I see this one being the one that most people default to. So what this means is, let's say you're playing a piece that's 16 measures, it's one page, and you figure out how to play it all pretty slowly. Maybe you get it to 60 beats per minute. You can play it from top to bottom, roughly around 60 beats per minute. The walking method of speeding up that piece, let's say our goal is 120, is to incrementally nudge the tempo forward. And you can do this by playing around with the metronome. I find that to be a really effective way to keep track of those incremental gains. In the same way that when you're lifting weights, you're not just lifting random weights and you don't know what the number is. You know specifically those are 15-pound weights, and maybe one day you'll work up to 18 pounds or something like that. So we want to have a specific tempo marking. So you can play the whole thing at 60 with a metronome, and then your next goal, maybe for the next day or two, is to try to incrementally tweak it up to 65. And then over the next few days, you try to bump it up a little further to 70. So what you're doing is you're slowly dialing up the metronome number over maybe 10, 15 beats in a single week. It depends on what the tempo is to begin with. Tempo jumps on the lower end are going to be harder and slower to accomplish than tempo jumps on the higher end. So for example, going from 140 to 160 is, depending on the piece, easier than going from 60 to 80, even though they're both 20 beats per minute increments. So you're playing those 16 bars, and then you tweak the metronome up a little bit, and then you play those 16 bars and you try to match it to that tempo. You get comfortable there, you sit at that plateau for a couple days, and then you tweak the metronome up a little bit, you sit at that plateau for a couple days to get comfortable with it, and so on and so on. And in about a month, you go from 60 to 120, assuming that you're increasing your tempo about 15, 20, somewhere in there per week. That's about a 5 beat per increment every day or two. Now, this is a really effective method, generally speaking, because this is a way to make sure that you're not going to have big holes in your practice. For example, if you can play an entire piece at 60, and then you can take that entire piece and tweak it to 65. That means everything is equivalized to 65. It doesn't mean that there's a patch in there that you can't actually play at 65. You can play literally everything at 65. You're raising the whole piece in unison. This is effective because a lot of times if people aren't very disciplined in their method of practice, they might be kind of speeding up here and there, but some parts of the piece lag behind. So maybe they can play the first 12 measures at 65, but the ending, they can only play at 55. They're not really strategic about how to bring that up to par with the rest of it. So if you're equivalizing your tempo increases, making sure that when you go from 65 to 70, every part of your piece is coming along for the ride, and parts that are resistant to that tempo increase, you're lasering in on and paying extra attention to. That's going to mean that when you speed up the piece, and you're going to have to be patient, because that 60 beat per minute gain over about 4 weeks is a patience game, right? But it means you're not going to be grinding. You're not going to be putting in hours and hours. You're just going to do like 15 minutes a day of consistent, steady effort. And it's going to yield you a very stable 120 beats per minute recording that doesn't feel like you're flying by on the seat of your pants, because it's been arrived at very gradually. It also means that everything is going to be nice and steady across the board. So you're not going to have parts of your piece that, if you've been, practicing with the strategy correctly, where you're having these dips of tempo or these consistent errors, because the whole point of the strategy is to equivalize everything as you go, so that there's not big gaps in complexity, so it all sounds kind of the same difficulty level. Okay, so that's the walking method. Again, it's really effective, and it's what most people default to. Now, the flying method takes a different approach. what it tries to do is, instead of speeding something up over the course of a month, it tries to speed something up over the course of a day. And the only way that this works is to work in really, really minute chunks. So if you have one bar of your music and you're struggling to speed it up, maybe you're struggling to go from 80 to 90 or 80 to 120 or whatever it happens to be. You feel like you're hitting some kind of ceiling, and no matter how much you nudge the metronome forward, you're not able to play your piece faster. Take a single individual measure, just one measure, plus a little extra. I'll show you when we actually get to the piano how I would strategize this. But you take one measure plus a little bit, and you do just that measure for about 5 minutes straight. And it's almost impossible not to speed up a section by doing that, because you're triggering your muscle movements at that point. Your muscle memory is kicking in. You'll probably memorize it within 5 minutes, because it's just a tiny increment, right? So you take a tiny increment, you do it for 5 minutes in a row, you're going to get like 30 repetitions or something. You're going to fly, because you're going to go from like 80 to 120 or 80 to 150 in a really short amount of time. And then in the next 5 minutes, you can do the next bar. And then in the next 5 minutes, you can do the next bar. And in a single 20-minute session, you've done 4 bars, 5 minutes each, and you've radically sped them up. Now, the kicker here is you aren't just going to spend 5 minutes and, oh, it's going to be fast forever. There's a couple other things you need to do to make sure that that speed is going to stick. Number one is you need to practice the bridges. So it's not enough to just practice measure 1. Measure 2, measure 3, measure 4 for 5 minutes each, and then yay, it's all going to work out. Because as soon as you try to string all of those together, it's probably not going to work. You're probably going to slow down. You're probably going to have hitches and catches, and it's going to not be your, as good as it sounded individually. So you need to practice bridging them. You need to spend, 5-10 minutes just practicing measure 1 and 2 together. So you're rolling straight from 1 to 2. You're doing a longer section. And then you're doing straight from 3 to 4. And then you're doing straight from 2 to 3. And then you're doing 1 to 4. So that adds another 20 minutes, just practicing connecting everything in a really seamless way. And then you have to deal with the fact that the next day, it's not going to be where it was the previous day. So you could end up going from 80 to 150 in a single day with, I don't know why you would do this, but that would be like 1 hour of work, let's say. And you had a huge tempo gain on one line of music in a single day. And you're feeling really good about yourself. You go to bed, you wake up, and you're like, oh, let's play that again. It's not going to be where you left it. You're going to need to spend a little bit of time, usually only about 5 minutes or so, reviewing what you did and doing a very accelerated version. 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, a couple minutes stringing it all together, and then it will be where it was the previous day. The next day you come back, kind of have to do the same thing again, but it'll be even more accelerated. So the flying method requires that you not only dedicate yourself to the bar by bar practice, but that you dedicate yourself to practicing stringing them together in longer segments, and that you also have to review it for at least a few days to make sure it sticks. This is one of the big benefits of this approach, though, is you can put in a similar amount of practice time and you're going to get the same result. But what this method does is it's going to help you crash through ceilings. So if you're hitting a tempo ceiling with a piece, let's say you're playing a Bach prelude and you really want to be able to play it at 120, but you can't get it past 100. Every time you try nudging the metronome forward a little bit, you stall. What you can do is you can take this flying approach and just apply it on a line-by-line basis. And it's still going to take you a few weeks to reach that milestone, just as it would be if you were incrementally moving the needle forward. But sometimes incrementally moving the needle forward stops. It stops working, you hit your ceiling. And the flying method really allows you to crash through that ceiling. That's why this is a really useful strategy for pieces that are fast. Because oftentimes 120 walking speed, that's usually pretty doable. That's like maybe a light allegro. But sometimes we have scherzos or pieces with a lot of 16th notes that are really, really fast. And the only way to bust through and get them at that speed is to do this incremental bar by bar flying strategy. So those are the two strategies to speed up pieces. I definitely favor one for when you're working on the slower segments. So if I'm starting a Bach piece from scratch and I know it's going to eventually be really fast. I'm going to be doing the walking method to get it to at least like kind of a moderato. And then once I'm at the moderato and I feel like I'm hitting my speed ceiling, that's when I'm going to use the flying approach to break through that ceiling and get from that 100 to 120 or whatever I need to do. So I like using them in tandem. I really like the walking approach because it's depending on what piece you're working on, it's a really good metronome feedback exercise. So again, if I'm doing Bach, I'm working with the metronome because it helps keep everything really tight. If you're doing something that's a lot more expressive, you might not be working with the metronome per se, but it's still worth it to try the metronome every once in a while to check in on what tempo you're landing on and to just make sure everything's pretty even so that you're not having like some pretty significant bends in your tempo. But again, slower pieces typically work better with the walking approach. Faster pieces, you're probably going to want to do a combination of both. Would I do the flying approach on its own ever? I don't know that I have used that approach in isolation. I usually use the flying approach as an adjunct, but I'd be curious to hear about what some of you have done. If you use either of these strategies in tandem, if you use one at a time, if you tend to favor one or the other. There are definitely pros and cons for each. So and we've kind of already touched on this. The biggest con for doing the walking approach is that you have to be patient. You're not going to be able to play something quickly instantly because it's the whole foundation of it is you walk. You're going to get there slowly. You're not running. So it's step by step, brick by brick, 15 minutes a day. You're not forcing anything. You're not putting in really hard labor, but you're going to get the end result if you're just patient with time, with a minimal amount of struggle. So there's a pro and a con in there. The con is you have to be patient and wait, but the pro is that you're not like grinding your way through the experience of practicing it. So it's a little more pleasant to practice in that way. The pro and con of flying, I think the biggest pro is that, as we've talked about, it allows you to bust through those plateaus. Sometimes a plateau really is a plateau and we just get stuck and we have to come back to it a year later. But sometimes this is the strategy that's necessary to get you to the next level with speed. So that's a really big upside. The downside is what would be I'm thinking out loud right now. The only downside that I can see is I don't feel like it would be very practical to use it only by itself. Again, I'd love to hear your experiences out there, just because it seems a little bit of a grind. So if you're learning a piece from scratch and you're doing the flying approach and you're trying to get a single measure from literally 0 to 100 in a single practice session, I don't know. I have a sense that that's going to feel a little bit more like a laborious practice session. Whereas practicing something and incrementally improving it is going to feel a lot more peaceful, a lot more relaxing versus the sort of extra. It's like, it would be the difference between like a nice light jog or walk around the block versus like a high intensity interval training exercise. It's not that one's bad, but it's going to maybe if you're doing it every single time, it might not be super sustainable. It might be the thing that makes you resist practicing a little bit. I'm totally speculating though, because as far as I know, when it's used in combination, it doesn't really have a downside. All right, so I'm going to take you to the piano and demo these ideas for you. All right, so I've got Prelude in F major, BWV 927 up, and I'm going to I haven't played it in a while, but I'll demonstrate how I would go about learning it. So first, I'm just going to take a look at the first line, make sure I remember the basic chord shapes. So I remember the right hand, the left hand, oops. And then putting it together, I'm going to just take my first baby deer shaky leg steps. And then I'm going to figure out where I'm at with the metronome. So I'm going to take it down to 70, and this is going to be in... this is actually technically 35 beats per minute, so I'm very slow here with what I've given. I'm going to try to play it with the metronome. So I made a lot of mistakes. I'm going to slow it down all the way to 60 and see if I can now do it with a clean performance. it wasn't perfect, but it was a little bit better. I feel like 60, I can spend the next 10 minutes working on that line, 60 beats per minute, feeling pretty good about it. And then I'm hoping that by the end of the week, I'm able to play the whole thing at 60. Once I'm able to do it at 60, I'm going to nudge the tempo forward a little bit. And now let's assume I've been doing it for a few days and I can start it off at 70 beats per minute. And that's basically just incremental gains. You can assume I've been working on it for a few minutes each day, trying to get it settled at 60. Then once I'm there, try to get it settled at 65. Then once I'm there, try getting it settled at 70, and so on. And assuming that I'm doing this with pretty much the whole piece. This is the walking strategy, really, really useful and a good way to correct any dodgy parts, because it allows you to notice, oh wow, I really can't keep up with that part at this tempo. So I need to hone in and spend a little bit of extra time there. All right, so now I've been practicing for a while. Let's say I've gotten it through this strategy of walking, gotten it to a moderate 100 beats per minute. I'm just going to play it through at 100, and we'll make sure that it's working at this tempo. So I'm able to do it at 100 beats per minute, but now I'm thinking, oh man, I'm really hitting a ceiling. I'm having a hard time. My fingers are stressed out, having a hard time crossing the threshold. So this is where we're going to apply the flying strategy. So I'm going to try to take it to, I'm at 50 beats per minute. I'm going to try to actually get the first measure up to speed, just to show you how's it going to work. So I'm going to go from 100 to 200, or another way, I'm going to go from 50. Actually, I'll put it all the way down at 50, even though I don't like the metronome slower than 60. You can hear that. 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and 1E and a 1N. There it is. All right, so that's where I'm at, and I want to get to twice that. So I'm not going to use the metronome for this. I'm going to just work on, since these are longer measures with more notes, I'm going to just do half a measure and start with that. Now let's see what 100 is going to sound like, just so I know what my goal is. Okay, I'm there. Okay, so now I got to figure out the second half of this measure. Bass rolling. Okay, so now I think I can do both little chunks of the measure. Now I have to work on bridging the measure together. It's going to take a bit of time. my fingers are getting all tangled up now. But I think I'm pretty close with that measure. 2, ready, go. Wow, I made it. Try it again. 2, ready, go. I feel shaky at that transition. All right, so then I figured out how to get a single measure up to speed, and I could do the same thing with the next measure, and then the next day I'm going to come back and I'm going to find that my fingers just don't have the same looseness they did. I'm going to need to relearn it a little bit, but I can keep pushing forward in that way, transforming this piece that I had at 50 beats per minute, taking all the way up to 100 beats per minute to cross through the threshold. All right, so hopefully this gave you some ideas on what to do about speeding up a piece, whether you're trying to break through a speed threshold or you're trying to be a little bit more deliberate on how you speed up pieces incrementally. Hopefully you got some ideas out of this particular video. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next video. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.